When I was trying to think of a way to begin this episode, my mind jumped to Field of Dreams because for a long time through production of the film, it was supposed to be called Shoeless Joe because the film was adapted from W.P. Kinsella's novel, Shoeless Joe. But the studio was afraid that, one, people wouldn't know the reference, and two, they'd think the film was about a homeless man named Shoeless Joe because he didn't have shoes. And this is funny because even at the time, in the 1980s, Shoeless Joe Jackson was one of the most well known ball players to non baseball fans because of Elliot Asinoff's book, Eight Men Out. But then, of course, thanks to Field of Dreams, Shoeless Joe Jackson became even more well known to people who didn't follow baseball. Of all the angles and facets of the story of the 1919 Black Sox scandal, we haven't talked about the one person who's given the story its long legs, Shoeless Joe Jackson, whose name is even part of this Russian doll of myths. According to writer David Fleitz, while playing a game in the minor leagues, Jackson couldn't wear his new cleats because they weren't broken in. So he played the game in his socks or stockings, and a reporter from the Greenville News dubbed him Shoeless Joe Jackson. Jackson later told another reporter, quote, "I've read and heard every kind of yarn imaginable on how I got the name. I never played the outfield barefoot, and that was the only day I ever played in my stockinged feet. But it stuck with me." End quote. Joe Jackson is a closet packed with contradictions. Open the door and you don't know what might fall out. He has the third highest career batting average among major league players, and yet he never won a batting title. He was illiterate and yet a sound businessman. Straightening out the myths and truths of Shoeless Joe is one of my favorite parts of this whole story. Sure, other players involved in the scandal were popular, but Shoeless Joe was already one of the greats. He played 9 full seasons with a career batting average of 356, which again is third best all time. Both Connie Mack and Ty Cobb said that Jackson was the finest natural hitter they'd ever seen, and Babe Ruth claimed to have modeled his swing off of Jackson's. Jackson was also seen as naive and simple, a country boy who just wanted to play baseball. So, for something like the scandal to not only happen to, but be caused by Joe Jackson, well, say it ain't so, Joe. This famous quote, by the way, is another myth. The perception of Joe Jackson is why this scandal and this story has persisted for more than 100 years. This is the legend of a giant torn down in his prime, forbidden to do the thing he loved most in the world because of greed and hubris and ignorance. And now he's forced to walk the earth with the weight of his sins forever dragging him down. If that's not a Greek myth, I don't know what is. And to add to the myth, Jackson has been portrayed over the last 60 years as mostly innocent. Sure, he took the money, but he supposedly tried to give it back. And this will be a key word in the story, supposedly. For example, Jackson's statistics during the World Series, in which he supposedly cheated, speak for themselves. His 375 batting average during the series was the highest of any player on either team, and his 12 hits broke a World Series record. It's one of the best all time World Series performances ever, and yet he was still banished. Tonight, the many faces, many facts, and many unknowns about Shoeless Joe Jackson and his role in the 1919 Black Sox scandal, and why, even in death, he's still seeking redemption. You're listening to the Midnight Library of Baseball. Tonight, part 3 of the greatest myth in baseball history.
It ain't true, is it, Joe? Became say it ain't so, Joe. In that little exchange, it ain't true, is it, Joe? Yes, son, I'm afraid it is. Well, I never would have thought it. There's the whole story right there. It was it in 1921. In a lot of ways, it's it in 2024.
Up next, Joe Jackson was one of the all time greats, hands down, and he would have been a shoo in, no pun intended, for the Hall of Fame. And yet, according to Charles Fountain, author of The Betrayal, if not for the 1919 scandal, Jackson, despite his statistical accomplishments, would not have been remembered. Here's Charles Fountain.
You say, all right, who sort of really sticks out in baseball history? And you can, list a whole litany of players from Babe Ruth and Cy Young down to Ohtani. Joe Jackson's going to be in the top 10 of most of those lists. And why? Was he that good as a player? Yes, he was, but so was Ty Cobb, so was Rogers Hornsby. Bona fide first ballot, absolutely no question Hall of Famers, no argument. But with Joe Jackson, it's much deeper than that. It's the tragic story. It's the illiterate Southerner who may have been a pawn in all of this and may not have known the magnitude of what he's doing, and maintained his innocence and batted, as Kevin Costner said, as Ray Kinsella in the book, batted 375 and never did anything to lose that series. So there's, he's become a very sympathetic figure.
In his book, The Betrayal, Fountain goes on to say, quote, had he played out his career without incident, he would have been a very early inductee into the Hall of Fame, and he would stand in history together with his peers like Walter Johnson, Rogers Hornsby, George Sisler, Tris Speaker, Cooperstown immortals all, and men remembered today by only the keenest of baseball historians. End quote. It's interesting to think about, right? And what would you prefer? To be remembered as an honest man for 30, 40 years? Or remembered for the next 100 years, but with an asterisk next to your name, with a black stain on your career? Of course, this is all well and good for legends, long dead. But what about the man who has to go on living and breathing and making a living after the scandal? Well, here's another one of those great misperceptions that Shoeless Joe was a sucker, an ignorant fool. Here's Jacob Pomrinky, editor of Scandal on the South Side.
He was illiterate. That is a fact. He could not read or write. He stopped going to school around the third grade or so to go work in the textile mills in South Carolina. But that does not mean that he was not a smart man. He was a very shrewd businessman, very successful businessman. That's something that people like to hold up for Shoeless Joe, is that, well, he was too dumb to know what he was doing and getting involved with. But he was a smart man, and he was very shrewd, and knew what he was doing, and certainly knew what he was getting into with the Black Sox scandal.
And according to Charles Fountain, Joe Jackson, a few years before the scandal, had confessed to his wife Katie that he wasn't enjoying the game as much anymore. So they both began investing in different businesses: dry cleaners, valet services, you name it. Over time, Joe Jackson, the illiterate rube, was in charge of at least 12 employees. From Fountain, quote, by the end of his playing career, he was making at least as much money from his business investments as he was from his baseball salary. And when the end of that baseball career came so suddenly in the fall of 1920, the unschooled, unlettered, so often ridiculed Joe Jackson was far better positioned than any of his Black Sox brothers to make a living in the life that would come after. End quote. So here's this guy, remembered as a fool, who is the only man prepared for the fallout after the scandal. There's no poverty, there's no pounding the pavement looking for work, or struggling for a minor league contract under an assumed name. Joe Jackson was set financially. He knew what he was doing. Now, when we come back to the fix, there are various opinions on whether Joe Jackson knew what he was doing. But the experts I spoke with were pretty clear in their opinions. Here's Bill Lamb, who spent years researching the legal details of both the 1920 and 1924 trials.
I want to start off by saying that, in my opinion, Joe Jackson was a great ball player and, by all accounts, a very nice man as well. But the fact of the matter is, he was an active participant in the Black Sox, in the corruption, rather, of the 1919 World Series, and that his subsequent denial of participation was false. His various accounts have had some impact on the assessment of his situation. But when you look at them, they really undermine the cause.
And here's Jacob Pomranke.
But one thing that we do know about the real Shoeless Joe is that he did take the gambler's money. There's absolutely no question about that. He admitted it under oath multiple times. His wife admitted it under oath. We even know what he did with the money. He used it to pay off his little sister's hospital bills in Savannah, Georgia. So, we've got all the information that we need to know, what his involvement was. And unfortunately, he told very different stories depending on when he was talking. So in 1920, he told a story about oh yeah, we did it. I was involved, and he was actually upset that he didn't get all the money that the gamblers promised him. But by 1924, a couple years later, he denied everything.
So remember how Charles Comiskey was trying to pretend like nothing happened after the World Series? Comiskey shrugged off the devastating betrayal of his players and then went ahead and paid them bigger contracts. Well, it may seem obvious, but after these players were banned from baseball, they didn't get those contracts or the salaries that came with them. Well, in 1924, Joe Jackson sued Comiskey and the White Sox, saying a contract is a contract, and he wanted his money. And he kind of had a point, because if Charles Comiskey knew his players had cheated and agreed to new salaries anyway, he was basically saying, I know what you did, and I'm going to pay you anyway to keep playing. So shouldn't he pay them? Apparently, the jury in 1924 thought so, because they awarded Joe Jackson nearly $17,000 in back pay. That's more than $300,000 today. But here's the thing. During this whole trial in 1924, Jackson kept changing his story about what happened in 1919. His perjury was so bad that the judge did something rarely done. He overruled the jury. He said Jackson would get no money, and he threw Jackson in jail for a night for lying so much. There's no doubt that Jackson took $5,000 from Lefty Williams, but did he throw the series? Well, here's another juicy debate. At first, it seems like there's no question Jackson played his ass off. He batted .375, highest average of any player in the series, and he broke a record for most hits in a World Series. He hit the only home run, and he had 6 total runs batted in and 5 runs scored. That's awesome. Stats don't lie, right? Well, maybe they do. In his article, Say It Ain't So for Joe in the Hall, ESPN sports writer Rob Nyer puts together a pretty compelling argument for Jackson throwing the games. Nyer writes, quote, the evidence suggests that the conspirators tried to win 3 games, and they tried to lose 5. Jackson hit .545 in the 3 games he wanted to win. In the first 4 games the conspirators wanted to lose, Jackson hit .250 with 0 RBIs. In the 5th fixed game, Jackson was hitless until the Reds were ahead 5-0, at which point he hit a solo home run. Later, with the Sox trailing the Reds 10-1, Jackson hit a meaningless 2-run double. End quote. So here, what Nyer is saying is Jackson hit well, but only when it suited the team, or when his hits didn't make a difference. Nyer goes on to say, quote, in the field, Jackson's play was questionable too. Triples are rarely hit to left field, yet in the 1919 World Series, 3 of Cincinnati's 9 triples were hit to left field, where Jackson was stationed. End quote. I mean, what do you think? To me, the triples stand out. I did some digging and couldn't find how many triples Jackson gave up during the season, but the White Sox as a team gave up 49 triples. That comes out to 1 triple every 2.8 games. And then they gave up 9 triples in the World Series, and Jackson gave up 3. That's suspicious right there. But giving up 3 from left field, right? That's the toughest place to get a triple. That's the shortest distance between the outfielder and third base. And while in the public trial in 1920, Jackson said he tried to win the whole time, there was something else happening in private. After the trial, Judge McDonald said of a private conversation with Jackson, quote, "He told me that he played hard, but said he could have played harder." End quote. This whole possibility is astounding to me because if Jackson was half-assing it, not trying his best, and still ended up with these crazy statistics, still broke a World Series record, what would it have been like if he was trying his hardest? If you think this show's worth $1, please donate at the website midnightlibraryofbaseball.com or through Podbean. You can also leave a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you listen to the podcast. I've also had a lot of requests for more listener baseball stories, but to include them, I need you to send them to me. So if you have a good story about what baseball means to you, please reach out to me at midnightlibraryofbaseball@gmail.com or through the link on my website, midnightlibraryofbaseball.com. Okay, back to the show. And this whole question of did he do it? Did he not do it? Did he play his hardest? Did he not? Did he want to take the money? How much was he involved? It's very complicated. When you start looking over the affidavits and court transcripts and first and second hand accounts, there's a lot to keep in your mind. That's one reason there are so many books on the event. But I want to take a moment and consider this man, Joe Jackson. Who was he and what was going on inside him? In David Fleitz's bio of Jackson, he includes this quote from 1949. And for some context, Joe Jackson was speaking to a reporter. And Jackson said, quote, "All the big sports writers seem to enjoy writing about me as an ignorant cotton mill boy with nothing but lint where my brains ought to be. That was all right with me. I was able to fool a lot of pitchers and managers and club owners I wouldn't have been able to fool if they'd thought I was smarter." End quote. If this is true, it's one hell of a performance. In one of my favorite movies, The Prestige, these 2 young magicians go to a magic show, and they watch this old Chinese man in this big robe pull off this amazing trick of making a giant fishbowl disappear. They can't figure it out. How did he do it? Until they realize the magic trick is not on the stage. The trick is that this old man is not really an old man. He's a young man with the strength to carry and walk off with this giant bowl between his legs under his robe. His magic trick is his entire life, living every day, every public moment in disguise as an old man. And apparently, this was Joe Jackson. It's hard to pull off, but if you can live every moment as an ignorant fool, people will constantly underestimate you. And to me, it's fascinating to consider this as a possible reason for why Jackson performed so well. Of course, he had amazing talent. He was, as Ty Cobb and Connie Mack said, a natural hitter. But in addition, maybe he was stealing signs. Maybe pitchers got lazy or sloppy around him and showed him their tells, like in poker. Even if they knew he was a great hitter, they still might have underestimated him because of the unconscious perception that he was dumb. And it's clear, not a question, that he was not dumb, that he knew what he was doing. Which brings us to Jackson's 180-degree turn at the 1924 trial, where he was trying to get his back pay from Charles Comiskey. We have, from the 1920 trial, Jackson confessing to cheating. We have irrefutable evidence that Jackson took $5,000 and used it for his sister's hospital bills, which, that in itself seems like a really kind thing to do. We have Jackson saying that he came forward at the trial because he was angry at Chick Gandil for not giving him the whole $20,000. We have Jackson telling the judge in private that he could have tried harder. And one point I didn't include from my conversation with Bill Lamb is that the guilty parties, like Chick Gandil and Eddie Seacott, did not go around accusing everyone on the team of cheating. They still had a code, and they only accused people that they said were definitely involved. And over, they pointed the finger at Joe Jackson. So all this information is out there. And yet in 1924, Jackson changed his entire story. He said he didn't want to cheat. He said he was barely involved, and then not involved. He said Lefty Williams tossed a stack of $5,000 at him, even though he wasn't involved. So what's going on? I'm not a historian, so I feel comfortable speculating. And what I think happened is that it took a while for Jackson and the others to fully grasp what had occurred. Even sitting in the courtroom, it might not have sunk in what was at stake and what the American people thought of them for cheating. I think we all have this happen from time to time when we do something to hurt someone else, but we don't at first see why it's such a big deal. But then when we finally get it, it's a gut punch of guilt. And people have a really hard time accepting guilt, owning it, and repairing relationships from this position. I'm so sorry. I can really see how much I hurt you through my actions. I feel awful inside. This doesn't usually happen. Think of all the athletes, the celebrities and politicians who just cannot apologize. It might have something to do with image, but it also has to do with truly sitting with guilt, because sitting with and feeling guilt is extremely painful. And for Joe Jackson, instead of owning up to his role, instead of facing his guilt, he pretended in 1924 that reality was not reality. And he lived the rest of his life pretending, which would have been possible for one of the all-time great pretenders. If he'd pretended to be an ignorant fool throughout his playing career, he certainly had a lot of practice. One of the most iconic moments in the entire story comes at the end of the 1920 trial, and this would have been 1921, when Jackson and his teammates are walking out of court, and this little boy stops Shoeless Joe and says, "Say it ain't so, Joe." And Joe, head hanging low, says, "Afraid it is, kid." Guess what? Not true. But according to Charles Fountain, it doesn't matter. Here's Fountain.
There was this exchange between Joe Jackson and a child that Fullerton described as one little urchin. And it went, "It ain't true, is it, Joe?" He said, "Yes, son, I'm afraid it is. I never would have thought it." And that was the story. They didn't jump on Fullerton's story the previous December when he suggested that the World Series had been crooked, but writers jumped on this. Writers like nothing other than taking somebody else's good story and embellishing it. So "It ain't true, is it, Joe?" became "Say it ain't so, Joe." And that became the resonant cry of America. "Say it ain't so, Joe. Tell us that this isn't happening." And afterlife of that story is that how could this have happened? That there were hundreds of people on those steps. How is it that only Hugh Fullerton heard this? How is it that nobody else wrote about this? He had to have made this up. But my feeling on the matter was it does not matter. Whether he made it up or whether he reported it exactly as it happened, that in that little exchange, it ain't true, is it, Joe? Yes, son, I'm afraid it is. I never would have thought it. There's the whole story right there in 3 sentences. It's the stunned disbelief of America that such a thing had happened, that the World Series was compromised, the admission, the shame of one of America's great heroes laid low by that sad admission, yes, son, I'm afraid it is. And then the confusion, I never would have thought it, the inability to comprehend what happened. Those 3 sentences are it. It was it in 1921, and in a lot of ways, it's it in 2024.
Evidence has grown over the years to show fairly definitively that all of the 8 men involved were guilty, if not of direct game fixing, then at least guilty of knowing and not reporting the scheme. As Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis stated after banning the 8 players, quote, "No player that sits in a conference with a bunch of crooked players and gamblers, where the ways and means of throwing games are planned and discussed, and does not promptly tell his club about it, will ever play professional baseball." End quote. In addition to his original sentence, Judge Landis also forbade the players from playing any type of high-level organized baseball, with threats that any of the players involved would then be banned. They were essentially outlaws. Here's Jacob Pomrinky.
Occasionally, Landis did follow through on that threat, and he did suspend a few players for playing with the Black Sox or with other exiled players. But more often than not, the commissioner just ignored it. He couldn't keep up with what was happening out in eastern Montana.
Is he the only player to supposedly play anonymously afterwards, or did other players do the same thing to try to?
That's another little bit of a myth, is that the
Yeah.
players did not use their own names. They used aliases to play independent and semi-pro baseball afterwards. There were occasions when Shoeless Joe and the other Black Sox players did use, false names. But more often than not, they actually used their real names to go out all over the country and play baseball for a living throughout the 1920s. And they could earn more money, and they could draw in bigger crowds by using their own names and advertising. Hey, I'm in South Georgia, a place that wouldn't get professional baseball for another 50 years. Come see the great Shoeless Joe Jackson. Come see Buck Weaver. Come see Eddie Seacott play. These are areas of the country that did not get Major League Baseball for a long time, and so if you wanted to see this type of talent on the field, they would advertise. They would, put up posters, put up in the newspaper advertisements saying, come out and watch the Black Sox play. More often than not, they used their own names, and they were quite famous in those areas for playing outlaw baseball.
I'm not sure which version I prefer here, the truth or the myth, because the myth has a romantic element to it. These 8 outcasts continuing to play baseball under assumed names just to keep playing the game they loved, versus the truth that they didn't use assumed names, and in fact their real names brought in fans by the boatloads. With the true version, I wonder what people thought. People who went to these games in the South and out West, far from organized professional baseball. Fans who got to see these amazing players, but fans who were also angered and heartbroken by what these players did to the game of baseball. Did the act of watching the grace and skill of Shoeless Joe Jackson swing a bat wipe away the heartbreak? Did witnessing his athletic movements on the base paths absolve him of his sins? Many years after Shoeless Joe Jackson died, People petitioned again and again to allow Jackson to enter the Hall of Fame. And there's a really good argument for this. Judge Landis banned these 8 players for life. For life. But when they died, doesn't the ban end? That's what some people thought. Unfortunately, Joe Jackson remains on the outside looking in, and it doesn't look like anything's going to change. Part of the reason this story endures is for the folk hero aspect, the devastating destruction of not only individual players and their promising careers, but imagining what could have been one of the greatest dynasties in baseball history. And for me, I love statistics. I love just looking up players and looking over their season and career stats. And I think a lot of other people out there are like me.
And it's not just about stats. Statistics are a shorthand for what a human being is capable of. Scrolling through the season by season statistics of Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig and Shoeless Joe Jackson is awe-inspiring. Our baselines of human possibility are set at a certain level. But when we see these numbers, we expand our boundaries. And that question that so often lies dormant resurfaces. What am I capable of? When Shoeless Joe Jackson was robbed of the remainder of his baseball career, we were robbed of being further inspired. We were robbed of awe.
If we look at how the Black Sox scandal is relevant today, it comes back to being honest about humanity. Not only what happens when you pretend humans are not humans, with human needs and human greed, but also from the standpoint of owners, businessmen. When you neglect someone for long enough, there's bound to be a fallout, whether it's an open revolt or your conscience eating you up from the inside, or in the case of the 1919 World Series fix, amputating a limb to save the body. The idea of denial and avoidance is probably the greatest lesson and can apply in any time period. The owners and administrators of baseball in the 1900s could not face the reality of publicly exposing game fixers because they could not face their role in driving players to fix games. So the denial continued on multiple levels until the situation was completely out of their control. And this is just as good of a lesson for us in our everyday lives. What are we avoiding? What are we denying? And at what cost? The next episode will be a bonus episode, an interview with myself and former MLB pitcher Jerry Blevins. We'll talk about the article Blevins wrote, which is fairly critical of the film Field of Dreams, which is interesting considering what Blevins does now for one of his businesses. After that, we'll move on to episode 4, titled Fallen Through the Cracks, about 2 extraordinary major league players with some ridiculous exploits on and off the field, who were somehow forgotten. One of the 2 men found his way back to the Hall of Fame, thanks to, of all people, Richard Nixon. The other, like Shoeless Joe Jackson, is still on the outside looking in. Coming soon on the Midnight Library of Baseball.
The show is produced and edited by me, Ben Orlando. Special thanks to Bill Lamb, Charles Fountain, and Jacob Pomerinke. Music by Sergei Papkin and Ashot Danielian at Pixabay. Good night.